The truth does not get louder when someone starts screaming. It simply waits for the paperwork. The soft electric hum of my garage door had barely begun when a terrified scream shattered the quiet Saturday morning across Silver Creek Estates. I froze with one hand still wrapped around my coffee mug as the door rolled upward inch by inch, revealing the polished front end of my restored classic Mustang sitting exactly where I had parked it the night before. Before the sunlight could even reach the chrome bumper, Melissa Grant came sprinting across the street with her phone already pressed against her ear. Her face was bright red with panic. Her expensive sunglasses bounced against her blazer, and she pointed directly into my garage as though she had just discovered the biggest crime our neighborhood had ever seen. "That is my car," she shouted so loudly that several nearby garage doors opened almost instantly. "He stole my car. I just bought that Mustang yesterday." Her voice echoed between the quiet homes as more neighbors stepped onto their driveways holding coffee cups and curious expressions. I looked at her for several seconds without saying a word because I honestly thought she had mistaken my house for someone else's. Then I noticed she was staring directly at the car sitting inside my garage, the same car I had spent nearly 4 years restoring one bolt, one panel, and one piece of chrome at a time. "Melissa," I said calmly, "that car has been in my garage for years." She ignored me completely. "Do not touch it," she yelled while speaking into the phone again. "Send the police right now. The thief is standing right here. I found my stolen vehicle." The dispatcher must have asked another question because Melissa immediately began describing my address, my clothing, and the exact color of the Mustang, as though she were reporting an active emergency. Within moments, more residents gathered along the sidewalk. Some whispered quietly, while others lifted their phones to record what they believed was unfolding. The atmosphere changed so quickly that it felt unreal. Only a minute earlier, I had been planning a peaceful drive along the lakeshore before breakfast. Now I was apparently the center of a public accusation without having moved more than a few feet from my own garage. I slowly placed my coffee mug on a nearby workbench and looked toward the Mustang resting beneath the morning sunlight. The deep metallic blue paint reflected perfectly across the polished concrete floor. Every detail remained exactly as I remembered finishing it after years of careful restoration, including the custom wheels, original badges, handwritten inspection stickers, and the tiny scratch near the rear quarter panel that happened during transport several years ago. None of those details seemed to matter anymore, because Melissa had already convinced herself that what she believed was true. Less than 5 minutes later, the distant sound of sirens drifted through the neighborhood. 2 patrol vehicles turned slowly onto my street before stopping directly in front of my driveway. The officers stepped out professionally, carefully observing everyone gathered nearby before approaching us. Melissa immediately pointed toward me again. "That is him," she declared with complete confidence. He opened his garage, and there was my Mustang. One officer looked toward me before calmly asking the question that would quietly determine everything that followed. "Sir," he said, "can you tell us whose vehicle this is?" I glanced once more at the Mustang, then back toward the officers, and quietly smiled because inside a fireproof cabinet only 20 feet away rested every document needed to answer that question beyond any possible doubt. My name is Nathan Carter, and although almost everyone standing in my driveway that morning believed they were looking at a stolen classic Mustang, I was actually looking at something far more valuable than an expensive automobile. I was looking at nearly 4 years of patience, thousands of carefully documented hours, and a lifetime of memories connected to a machine that had become part of my family long before Melissa Grant ever moved into Silver Creek Estates. The officers waited calmly while I answered their first questions, but before explaining anything, I asked one simple question of my own. "May I retrieve the ownership documents from inside my house?" One officer nodded politely while his partner remained near the driveway speaking with Melissa, who continued insisting that she had purchased the exact same Mustang less than 24 hours earlier from what she described as a highly respected specialty dealership outside the city. I quietly walked through the open garage, past the familiar scent of fresh wax, clean leather, and motor oil that always lingered around the car after weekend detailing sessions. Every shelf inside the garage reflected years of careful organization. Specialized tools hung in perfect order, framed photographs documented different stages of the restoration, and original factory manuals rested beside labeled storage cabinets containing spare components collected over many years. I stepped inside my home and walked directly into the study where a fireproof document cabinet stood against the wall beneath framed photographs of my father and me working on the Mustang during its earliest restoration days. My father had purchased the car decades ago before passing it to me, asking only one thing: keep it on the road and take care of it the way we always did together. That promise had guided every decision I made afterward. I unlocked the cabinet and removed a thick leather binder containing every document connected to the car. The original title rested inside a protective sleeve beside registration certificates, insurance policies, restoration invoices, appraisal reports, maintenance logs, emissions inspections, photographs taken throughout the restoration process, transport receipts, and certified copies of historical ownership records. I even kept every service invoice organized by year because experience had taught me that preserving documentation often matters just as much as preserving the vehicle itself. Returning outside, I noticed the crowd had nearly doubled. More neighbors had gathered along the sidewalks, while several children watched curiously from nearby front lawns. The officers accepted the binder with quiet professionalism, carefully reviewing the title before comparing the vehicle identification number listed on the paperwork against the identification plate visible through the windshield. Melissa folded her arms confidently, clearly expecting the officers to discover something that would confirm her accusation. Instead, they continued turning pages one document at a time without changing their expressions. One officer looked toward me and asked how long I had owned the Mustang. Officially, I answered, almost 12 years. My family has cared for it much longer than that. Melissa immediately interrupted, insisting the dealership had guaranteed that the car she purchased was authentic, legally available, and ready for delivery after final paperwork. Hearing those words, the officer calmly closed the binder before asking the question nobody standing there seemed prepared to answer. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "do you happen to have your purchase agreement or the vehicle identification number from the car you believe belongs to you?" For the first time that morning, Melissa stopped speaking, and the confident certainty on her face slowly gave way to hesitation as she reached for her phone, unaware that the next few minutes were about to reveal a very different story than the one she had imagined. Melissa unlocked her phone with slightly trembling hands while one of the officers patiently waited beside her. The crowd that had gathered along the sidewalks grew noticeably quieter, replacing whispers with complete silence as everyone realized the situation was no longer as straightforward as it had seemed only minutes earlier. She scrolled through several emails before opening the purchase confirmation from the specialty dealership she had proudly mentioned. "Here," she said with renewed confidence, turning the screen toward the officer. "I paid the deposit yesterday. They told me the car was being prepared for delivery." The officer studied the email carefully before asking another simple question. "Did you actually take possession of the vehicle?" Melissa hesitated for a moment. "Not yet," she admitted. "They said I could pick it up next week after final detailing and registration." The officer nodded without offering an opinion. "Do you have the vehicle identification number listed anywhere in your paperwork?" Melissa continued searching through her emails while I remained standing quietly beside my garage. The morning sun had climbed higher above the neighborhood, casting bright reflections across the Mustang's polished blue paint. Looking at the car, I remembered spending countless evenings with my father inside this very garage replacing worn components, rebuilding the engine, restoring faded trim, and carefully documenting every stage with photographs that still rested inside the binder now sitting in the officer's hands. Those memories mattered far more to me than the car's market value because every restored part carried a story attached to it. Eventually, Melissa located a digital purchase agreement and handed her phone to the officer. He compared the information on her screen against the registration documents I had provided before writing several notes inside a small notebook. His partner carefully examined the vehicle identification plate visible through the windshield and then compared it with the number stamped inside the driver's side door frame. Both numbers matched my title exactly. Without raising his voice, the officer asked Melissa another question. "Ma'am, have you personally inspected the vehicle you agreed to purchase?" She slowly shook her head. "No. The dealership showed me photographs online and assured me it was being stored until delivery." The officer thanked her before stepping a few feet away to make a phone call. Several neighbors exchanged uncertain glances as the atmosphere shifted once again. Earlier they had watched what they believed was an obvious vehicle theft. Now they watched two officers carefully verifying documents while the original accusation seemed to grow weaker with every passing minute. One neighbor quietly approached me and apologized for assuming the worst. I simply smiled because I understood how quickly appearances can influence people before all the facts become available. A few minutes later, the officer ended his phone call and returned with a thoughtful expression. He explained that the dealership had confirmed Melissa had indeed purchased a classic Mustang matching the same model year, exterior color, and factory trim package as mine. However, the representative also stated that Melissa's vehicle remained inside the dealership's secured showroom awaiting final registration paperwork. It had never left their possession. The officer looked from Melissa toward me before speaking carefully. At this point, there is no indication that this vehicle belongs to anyone other than Mr. Carter. Melissa stared silently at the Mustang sitting inside my garage, as though trying to understand how two nearly identical cars could exist. What none of us realized yet was that one small detail buried inside the dealership records was about to explain not only her mistake, but also why she had been so completely convinced that my car was supposed to be hers. The officer asked Melissa if she would be comfortable allowing him to contact the dealership one more time while everyone remained present. She agreed immediately, convinced the second conversation would finally uncover the mistake she believed had been made. Standing only a few feet away, I quietly closed the leather binder and rested it on the workbench inside my garage while the neighborhood remained unusually silent. Even the children who had been whispering to one another only minutes earlier now watched the officers with complete attention. The officer activated the speaker function on his phone so both parties could clearly hear the conversation. After confirming the dealership's identity, he politely requested that a sales manager verify several details regarding the Mustang Melissa had agreed to purchase. The manager responded professionally, confirming the vehicle remained inside the dealership's climate-controlled showroom awaiting final registration paperwork. He then asked for the vehicle identification number listed on Melissa's purchase agreement. The officer slowly read the number aloud before comparing it with the number printed on my title and visible on the Mustang parked inside my garage. They were completely different. At first glance, the cars appeared almost identical. Both were the same model year, painted the same rare metallic blue, equipped with nearly identical factory trim, and restored to exceptionally high standards. However, the vehicle identification numbers proved beyond question that they were two entirely different automobiles. The officer thanked the manager, but before ending the call, he asked one final question. Did anything occur during the sales process that may have caused confusion? The manager paused for several seconds before answering. Actually, yes. During the presentation yesterday, our marketing display accidentally included photographs from another restored Mustang featured in a collector publication several years ago. Those photographs should never have appeared alongside our current inventory listing. We corrected the mistake after the customer completed her paperwork. Melissa looked stunned. What photographs? She asked quietly. The manager explained that one of the promotional images mistakenly uploaded by the dealership showed a beautifully restored Mustang owned by a private collector rather than the vehicle currently being sold. I immediately recognized what had happened because I remembered allowing a national collector magazine to photograph my Mustang after completing its restoration 2 years earlier. Several of those photographs had circulated through enthusiast publications and online collector articles. The dealership had unknowingly used one of those editorial images while advertising a completely different Mustang with similar specifications. The officer slowly lowered his phone and looked toward the car inside my garage once more. Suddenly, Melissa's certainty made perfect sense. She had spent hours admiring photographs of what she believed was her future car, never realizing the images actually belonged to mine. She had seen the exact same blue paint, the same custom wheels, the same restored interior, and even the tiny scratch near the rear quarter panel visible in one published photograph. When my garage door opened that morning and she saw those familiar details sitting only a few houses away, she genuinely believed she had found the vehicle she had just purchased. The misunderstanding no longer appeared reckless. It appeared human. Even so, assumptions had transformed. into public accusations before anyone compared a single document or verified a single identification number. The officers quietly returned my binder, while several neighbors exchanged embarrassed glances, realizing how quickly confidence can spread through a crowd when nobody pauses long enough to examine the evidence first. The senior officer thanked the dealership representative before ending the call, then looked around at the gathering of neighbors who had witnessed the entire exchange. The atmosphere felt completely different from only 30 minutes earlier. The hurried whispers had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence as everyone processed how a simple assumption had grown into a public accusation involving police officers, a classic car, and an innocent homeowner. Melissa lowered her phone and stared at the driveway without speaking. Her confidence had faded, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that every conclusion she had reached that morning had been based on photographs instead of verified facts. The officer returned my leather binder with both hands and smiled politely. "Everything appears to be in perfect order, Mr. Carter. Thank you for keeping such complete documentation." I thanked him and carefully placed the binder back onto the workbench inside my garage. Looking at the organized pages inside reminded me of something my father used to say whenever we finished another stage of restoring the Mustang. Take care of the records as carefully as you take care of the car. Someday the paperwork may become just as valuable. At the time, I thought he simply enjoyed staying organized. Standing there that morning, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Melissa slowly walked a few steps toward the garage, stopping several feet away from the Mustang. Without the excitement and confusion of the previous half hour, she examined the car more carefully than before. She noticed details she had overlooked during her emotional reaction, including the framed restoration photographs hanging on the garage wall, the collection of trophies from local automobile shows, and several pictures showing my father standing beside the same Mustang years earlier. One photograph displayed the car sitting in nearly identical condition almost a decade before Melissa had even moved into the neighborhood. She quietly looked toward me. "I never saw those pictures before," she admitted. I nodded. "Most people never have a reason to look inside someone else's garage." She gave a small, embarrassed smile before glancing back at the framed photographs. One of the officers gently explained that misunderstandings involving collectible vehicles were uncommon but not impossible, especially when similar models shared the same factory colors and restoration styles. However, he also reminded everyone present that ownership should always be confirmed through registration records, titles, and vehicle identification numbers before accusations were made. Several neighbors nodded in agreement. One older resident quietly admitted that he had assumed the worst the moment Melissa began shouting because she sounded completely certain. Another neighbor confessed that he had already texted someone across town describing what he believed was a stolen collector car before hearing the full story. Their honesty revealed how quickly certainty can spread through a community when nobody pauses to verify the facts. Melissa finally took a slow breath before speaking clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Nathan, I owe you an apology. I truly believed I was looking at the car I had just purchased. I should have asked questions before calling the police." Her words carried genuine sincerity, and I appreciated that more than any dramatic explanation. Mistakes happen. What matters is how people respond after learning the truth. The officers prepared to leave, satisfied that the ownership issue had been completely resolved, but before anyone walked away, one of them turned back toward Melissa with a thoughtful expression. "Ma'am," he said kindly, "you may also want to contact the dealership again. If those promotional photographs caused this much confusion here today, there may be other customers who deserve a clearer explanation as well." None of us realized then that the dealership's response to that suggestion would uncover an even larger problem than anyone standing in my driveway had imagined. Later that afternoon, I followed the officer's suggestion and called the specialty dealership myself, not because I wanted compensation or an apology, but because I genuinely wanted to understand how such an extraordinary misunderstanding had happened in the first place. The sales manager immediately recognized my name after speaking with the officers earlier that morning and invited both Melissa and me to visit the dealership the following day so they could explain everything in person. To my surprise, Melissa accepted the invitation without hesitation. The next afternoon, we arrived separately and were welcomed into a conference room overlooking the showroom where her Mustang remained on display beneath bright showroom lights. At first glance, it looked remarkably similar to mine. The same model year, the same metallic blue paint, the same factory trim package, and nearly identical wheels explained why the photographs had caused so much confusion. The differences only became obvious after placing both sets of documentation side by side. The sales manager began by offering a sincere apology to both of us before presenting the dealership's internal marketing records. During a recent website redesign, an employee responsible for updating online listings accidentally selected several editorial photographs from a national collector magazine instead of the dealership's own inventory images. Those editorial photographs happened to feature my Mustang because it had appeared in a restoration article celebrating uncommon American classics. The mistake remained online for several days before being discovered, and unfortunately Melissa completed her purchase during that exact period. The manager admitted that although the written description correctly identified the vehicle for sale, the accompanying photographs showed my privately owned Mustang instead. He explained that the dealership had already begun reviewing every active listing after realizing similar image errors had affected several other collector vehicles. Melissa quietly listened while reviewing the printed comparison between the published photographs and the actual showroom car. Once she saw the side-by-side images, even she smiled slightly. The similarities were remarkable, but the small differences suddenly became impossible to ignore. My Mustang carried a unique steering wheel selected during restoration, custom interior stitching completed by a local craftsman, and the tiny scratch near the rear quarter panel visible in every magazine photograph. Her newly purchased Mustang featured its own beautiful history, different restoration details, and a completely separate vehicle identification number. The confusion had never involved ownership. It involved mistaken identity created by inaccurate marketing photographs. The dealership formally apologized again and promised to update every listing immediately while introducing new verification procedures requiring photographs, vehicle identification numbers, and inventory records to be reviewed together before publication. Melissa thanked the manager for the explanation before turning toward me. "I understand now why I believed what I saw," she said quietly. "But I also understand why I should have verified everything before assuming the worst." I appreciated her honesty because admitting a mistake in front of strangers is never easy. As we walked through the showroom together, we stopped beside her Mustang for the first time without confusion or accusations. It was a beautiful automobile in its own right, deserving to be appreciated for its own story rather than compared with mine. Standing between the two nearly identical classics, I realized how easily appearances can convince people they already know the truth. Fortunately, facts have a way of waiting patiently until someone finally decides to look closely enough to find them. When Melissa finally drove her own Mustang home the following weekend, something unexpected happened throughout Silver Creek Estates. Instead of talking about stolen cars, police officers, or embarrassing misunderstandings, neighbors began talking about documentation, verification, and the importance of slowing down before reaching conclusions. The entire experience had quietly become a lesson that extended far beyond two nearly identical collector cars. At the next monthly Homeowners Association meeting, Melissa surprised everyone by requesting a few minutes at the beginning of the agenda before any routine business was discussed. The clubhouse filled with familiar faces from across the neighborhood, many of whom had witnessed the events in my driveway only days earlier. Standing behind the podium without her usual confidence, Melissa openly described what had happened from beginning to end. She explained how quickly she had allowed certainty to replace verification after recognizing photographs that looked identical to the Mustang inside my garage. She admitted that calling the police before confirming the vehicle identification number or reviewing the dealership paperwork had been a mistake, even though she genuinely believed she was protecting her property. Her honesty immediately changed the tone of the meeting. Nobody interrupted. Nobody criticized her. Instead, residents listened carefully because many realized they had made similar assumptions in far less dramatic situations over the years. Melissa then introduced several new recommendations for the association. Any future neighborhood concern involving property ownership would first require reasonable verification before public accusations or official reports were made. Community newsletters would include reminders encouraging residents to communicate directly with one another whenever practical before assuming the worst. The association also proposed educational workshops covering vehicle registration, property documentation, emergency reporting, and practical ways to distinguish facts from appearances during unexpected situations. The board unanimously supported every recommendation. After the meeting concluded, several neighbors walked over to speak with me. One family admitted they had nearly posted photographs from my driveway onto social media before realizing the officers were still investigating. Another resident apologized for believing the accusations simply because they had sounded convincing. I thanked each of them because I understood how easily people can be influenced by confident voices when complete information is still missing. The following Saturday morning, Melissa visited my garage once again, although this time the atmosphere could not have been more different. Instead of police vehicles lining the street, two classic Mustangs sat side by side beneath the warm morning sunlight, while curious neighbors admired both restorations. Melissa asked thoughtful questions about the techniques my father and I had used while rebuilding my Mustang, and I enjoyed hearing the story behind her own newly purchased car. Although the vehicles shared remarkable similarities, each carried its own unique history, different restoration journey, and different family memories. Those differences made both automobiles more meaningful rather than less. Looking around the driveway filled with friendly conversations instead of suspicion, I realized the misunderstanding had produced something surprisingly positive. Neighbors who barely knew one another before now gathered regularly to share automotive stories, restoration advice, and local car show recommendations. What began with a mistaken accusation gradually evolved into a stronger sense of community, built upon communication instead of assumptions. Standing beside the Mustang my father had trusted me to preserve, I quietly remembered his favorite saying once again. Machines can always be repaired. Trust takes longer, but it is worth rebuilding. Watching neighbors laugh together beneath the bright morning sky, I knew that trust had finally begun returning to Silver Creek Estates, not because everyone avoided mistakes, but because everyone had learned how to respond when the truth finally came into view. As autumn gradually settled over Silver Creek Estates, the neighborhood looked exactly the way people imagined an American lakeside community should. Golden leaves drifted across quiet streets, morning mist floated above the water, and every weekend seemed to bring another gathering of neighbors enjoying the walking trails, marina, or community park. What surprised me most was how often people stopped beside my driveway, not because of the misunderstanding anymore, but because they genuinely wanted to learn about the Mustang and the restoration process behind it. The garage that had once become the center of an embarrassing public accusation slowly transformed into an informal meeting place where conversations revolved around craftsmanship, history, and shared hobbies instead of suspicion. Melissa also embraced the opportunity to rebuild trust through consistent actions rather than words alone. During every homeowners association meeting, she encouraged residents to verify concerns privately before escalating them into public disputes whenever circumstances safely allowed. New informational guides explaining basic property documentation, vehicle registration, and practical communication procedures were distributed throughout the neighborhood. The association even invited a local police community outreach officer to speak about responsible reporting, explaining that providing accurate information during emergency calls helps officers protect everyone involved while reducing unnecessary confusion. Attendance exceeded expectations because many residents realized they had never fully understood how quickly assumptions could influence an entire neighborhood. Several weeks later, our community organized its annual charity car show beside the lakeshore. Families arrived carrying folding chairs. Children admired classic automobiles lined neatly beneath colorful autumn trees, and local food vendors filled the air with the familiar aromas of fresh barbecue, roasted corn, and warm apple cider. For the first time, my Mustang and Melissa's Mustang were displayed side by side with detailed information cards explaining their completely different histories, restoration journeys, and documented ownership records. Visitors smiled when they learned why the two nearly identical cars had become unexpectedly famous throughout the community. Instead of laughing at anyone's mistake, people appreciated the reminder that appearances rarely tell the complete story. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed neighbors introducing themselves to one another far more easily than before. Conversations flowed naturally between longtime residents and newly arrived families, creating a stronger sense of community than I had experienced in years. Even the officers who had responded that Saturday morning visited the event while enjoying a well-deserved day off. They recognized both cars immediately and stopped to admire the craftsmanship. One officer quietly joked that he was relieved to see the only competition taking place now involved friendly voting for the Best Restoration Award rather than determining ownership. Everyone laughed, including Melissa and me. Looking around the lakeside park filled with smiling families, beautifully restored automobiles, and neighbors enjoying each other's company, I realized the misunderstanding had gradually become part of the community's shared history in the healthiest possible way. It no longer represented embarrassment or conflict. Instead, it reminded everyone that patience, respectful communication, and reliable documentation create stronger neighborhoods than assumptions ever could. As the sun slowly settled behind the lake, reflecting warm shades of orange across both Mustangs parked side by side, I quietly understood that preserving trust requires the same care as restoring a classic automobile. Every detail matters. Every step deserves patience, and lasting results always come from doing the work carefully instead of rushing toward conclusions. Nearly a year has passed since that unforgettable Saturday morning. Yet every time I press the garage door remote, I still hear the quiet electric motor before anything else. The door rises smoothly, morning sunlight spills across the polished concrete floor, and the familiar metallic blue Mustang waits exactly where it has always belonged. The difference now is not the car. The difference is the neighborhood standing around it. Silver Creek Estates has become a community where people ask questions before making accusations, where documents are checked before assumptions spread, and where neighbors choose conversations before conflict whenever possible. Every Saturday morning, I still wipe a light layer of dust from the Mustang with the same soft cloth my father once used, carefully polish the chrome trim, and review the maintenance log after every drive. Some habits are worth preserving because they remind us that responsibility is built through consistency rather than dramatic moments. The leather binder containing the title, registration, insurance records, restoration photographs, service history, appraisal reports, and every receipt remains inside the same fireproof cabinet in my study. I rarely need to open it anymore, but I never consider throwing it away. Those pages tell the complete story of the car just as clearly as the restoration itself. Occasionally, a new family moves into the neighborhood and hears bits and pieces about the misunderstanding involving two nearly identical Mustangs. Longtime residents usually smile before explaining what actually happened. They do not tell the story as neighborhood gossip anymore. They tell it as a reminder that confidence without verification can create unnecessary problems for everyone involved. Melissa continues serving the community in different ways, although with a noticeably different leadership style than before. She often reminds new committee members that every decision deserves careful review and that original records should always be consulted before relying upon summaries or assumptions. Watching that change has been one of the most encouraging outcomes of the entire experience because genuine accountability creates lasting improvement far more effectively than embarrassment ever could. The specialty dealership also kept its promise. Every collector vehicle listing now includes verified photographs, matching vehicle identification numbers, and multiple quality control reviews before publication. Several months after everything happened, the sales manager mailed me a handwritten letter thanking me for handling the misunderstanding with patience instead of anger. He explained that the dealership's updated procedures had already prevented several potential mistakes involving other collector vehicles. Reading that letter reminded me that even uncomfortable moments can produce positive changes far beyond the people directly involved. One quiet evening, I parked the Mustang beside the lake after a leisurely drive through the countryside. The water reflected the orange colors of the setting sun while a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine trees across the shoreline. Sitting behind the steering wheel, I thought about my father, the years we spent restoring the car together, the unexpected misunderstanding that briefly placed it at the center of our neighborhood, and the simple truth that ultimately resolved everything. The most valuable part of the Mustang was never its rarity, its restoration, or its market value. Its greatest value came from the history carefully preserved inside every photograph, every document, every memory, and every lesson connected to it. As I slowly drove home and pressed the garage door remote one more time, the familiar hum echoed through the quiet evening exactly as it had on that unforgettable morning. This time, however, nobody shouted, nobody panicked, and nobody questioned who owned the car. The neighborhood had learned that the loudest voice rarely carries the strongest truth. Real justice arrives quietly, supported by patience, evidence, honesty, and the courage to verify the facts before reaching conclusions. And that lesson became far more valuable than any classic automobile could ever be.